Hey guys, before we begin today's lecture, I want to give you a quick heads up. Today's class is going to look a little different. I'm running a bit of an experiment. I want to try something we haven't done before. Today's lecture video is, as you've already noticed, I'm sure, quite short. After the video, we're going to head to Zoom instead of to live stream. And the reason for that is that we're going to do a little bit of discussion and application activity together, where I need a lot more participation and feedback than I can get in the live stream. In the last lecture, what I did is introduce a principle and then apply it to several cases for you when we discuss the cases. What we're going to do today is I'm going to introduce some principles and let you do the application work. That's what we'll be doing in our Zoom, and if all goes well, in the breakout groups that Zoom provides. So, yes, you should still outline today's lecture, but that's not going to be the most important part of your grade for today's class. More of it will be based on your participation and your answers in those Zoom activities after the lecture. However, there's one other note I need to make. You're going to outline today's lecture, you're going to post your comment under this video just like usual, but you will not be allowed into the Zoom meeting until I have your comment. So you watch the lecture, you post your outline, only then may you join the Zoom. It's like an entrance ticket. So that's part of my way to keep track of who's watching the lecture and watching it right on time as opposed to showing up 5 minutes after everyone else is done and submitted. So, very brief lecture. Submit your outline of it, which is only going to be a few lines long. That's your entrance ticket to Zoom, where we'll do some application work. See you soon. Hello, and welcome back to our morality class. Today, we're going to talk about what are probably the most controversial, challenging, uncomfortable, hard cases that are relevant under the Fifth Commandment. See, what we looked at last time was the principle of double effect. The fact that you can do something good, even though it has bad consequences, and it still be good. We looked specifically at bioethical medical practitioner examples to illustrate that concept. Although what we're going to see today is it does have other applications. The general idea we've looked at so far is you shall not kill. That is to say, you shall not knowingly, willingly separate a human body from human soul. That is, instigate death. That is, kill. What we're going to look at today is the circumstances under which it might be reasonable to kill. Not willfully, not intentionally, and not against an innocent person, not without provocation. But what we're going to look at today is the legitimate use of force for self-defense or similar means. Legitimate use of force, even resulting in death of the other person, but that does not violate the command, you shall not kill. I'll start by going through the principles. I'll wrap up with a disclaimer or reflection, and then we'll take it to some application work. So the obvious question here is, isn't you shall not kill pretty clear? Isn't it open and shut? How could there be a loophole or an exception here? Aren't Christians required to just be pacifists, to be nonviolent, to never engage in violence? The answer to that last question is no. While it's part of the Christian tradition to be pacifist and to be nonviolent, it's not required, it's not universal, and there are limited circumstances under which use of force, what you might call violence, is actually an appropriate moral course of action. These circumstances are extremely limited. The level of force is extremely limited. This is not an argument for violence, but it is a recognition that violence is not the worst thing. Much like in the last lecture we pointed out, death is not the worst thing. Sin is. What we're going to look at today is that sometimes the use of physical force against even another human being is not always evil. It's important to point out, it's never the good we hope for. It's not the goal. We don't want to encourage or say violence or use of force is good, but it's often the lesser evil and therefore morally responsible course of action. Again, under these limited circumstances. Instead of going through a bunch of examples for you, what I want to do is just give you the conditions. Now, what I'm about to do is summarize what conditions are necessary for physical force against another person to be reasonable or appropriate. And you guys are going to work through the examples in a few minutes. What I'm going to do is paraphrase a paragraph from the Catechism of the Catholic Church that's specifically about military force in the case of international conflict. However, what I'm going to show you is that those same principles can be applied to much smaller cases, like interpersonal interactions with another person. The principles are general, and the other language in the Catechism in other paragraphs bears this out. I'm going to try to give you the hyper-simplified, hyper-reduced version. What I'm going to give you, based again on St. Thomas Aquinas and developed later, are 4 principles. And I'm kind of condensing and shuffling, but I'm drawing these from Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 2309, if you want to read more in depth. But here's my simplified version of these 4 principles. In order for it to be legitimate, for you to use physical force, even physical force that might result in the death of another person, here are the conditions. 1, reaction against a hostile aggressor. Christians never throw the first punch. We just don't. It's not who we are. We don't instigate violence. The only circumstance which is going to allow for this kind of use of force is that, 1, you don't provoke it, you're reacting. And 2, you're reacting against someone who is in a serious and deleterious and harmful way coming at you, or someone under your protection and care. And you're reacting against a very serious, very aggressive hostility that really will damage, harm, or kill you or someone for whom it's your responsibility to care. That's condition 1, reaction against a hostile aggressor. 2, it's got to be a last resort. You cannot respond to violence with violence if there's another way. And often, the other way is simply walking away or negotiating or accepting some small harm, etc. Yeah, the other guy throws a punch, you take it and walk away. Guess what? You're going to be embarrassed. But you're not going to be dead, and you're not going to have sinned. That's a good outcome. Last resort. The only circumstance under which it's acceptable to use violence is when you absolutely have to. You have tried and failed at other means. That's going to be important when we look at specific examples. Condition number 3, chance of success. If there's no reasonable hope for a good outcome, then why would you go through simply put, the horrors of instigating violence, either you against another person or a nation against a nation, etc. There has to be a reasonable chance that you're going to succeed in what it is you're trying to accomplish, which again should be defense of you or someone under your care. And condition number 4, proportionality. The force with which you respond against an aggressor must be proportional to the response they use, the aggression they direct at you, and to the evils avoided. If someone walks up to you, aggressive, shouting, cursing, spitting, and shoves you, you don't get to shoot them. That's not proportional. You've gone way above and beyond the level of force necessary. Proportionality. What damage, what destruction, what evil are you preventing by intervening with force? You'd better not use more force than would be incurred by the force directed against you. 4 conditions. Reaction against hostile aggression. Last resort. Reasonable chance of success. Proportion. What we're going to do in our Zoom discussion today, I'm going to give you several test case scenarios. And you're going to show me, is this a legitimate use of force against another human person or human persons? If so, why? If not, under which conditions does it fail? We're going to apply it to a handful of test cases. Specifically, we're going to look at going to war, we're going to look at getting in a fist fight, and we're going to look at capital punishment. If you're lucky, we'll have time for a 4th, even more interesting, even more slightly convoluted example that's really going to hopefully change how we look at this. But those are exercises to which we're going to try to apply this. So take a few minutes and make sure you understand each of those principles before submitting or outlining and moving into the Zoom chat. That's all for today before we go in and apply these 4 principles to various test cases. And by the way, here they are written out to help you take your notes quickly so we can get right on with the practical applications today. You must, of course, put these in your own words for your outline, but this is here to help guide you. Oh, and one last point. You'll notice I keep saying legitimate or justified use of force or violence. There is a time and a place when it may be or could be a right thing to do to respond with force. And almost always it's when you're responsible for the protection of someone smaller, weaker, defenseless, who needs you to stick up for them. Not for the sake of your own ego. But again, you'll notice I'm not saying those are goods or lesser evils. And while in the order of justice, it might be acceptable to use force under these limited conditions, I would even still urge you to consider that under the order of charity, might it not be better to just accept the force used against you? Wouldn't it be utterly ridiculous for someone to just accept murderous, violent anger directed against them to the point of their own suffering and even death? Well, yes, it would. It's called Jesus and the cross. There may be times when it's acceptable to respond with force, but even in those times, I'll urge you to consider, would it not be more Christ-like? Would it not be more charitable to accept as Christ accepted and uniting yourself with him, suffering abuse at the hands of others for the sake of your own sanctification, to avoid even the temptation to sin in very limited response with force? There is a very real tradition of pacifism, of utter nonviolence, of being willing to be abused in any kind and number of ways, even to the point of humiliation, torture, death, you name it, in our faith and in our tradition of Christianity, and that's a good thing. What we're doing today is pinning down the absolute limits of violence. Not saying you get to use violence up to this point, but rather the extreme ends at which we'll tolerate violence, which we hate and detest and want to avoid whenever possible, are these. It's not a good, it's a lesser evil. Could you grow spiritually from just accepting suffering when it's directed against you? Jesus did. Anyway, that's going to wrap it up for today. I look forward to your very quick, very brief outlines and to some practical examples together in our Zoom group. See you soon. God bless.